welcome again to our preparation for the coming Sunday this week, the 28th Sunday of the church year. And the readings are, first of all, from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 25, 6, verse 6 to 10. A section from Paul's letter to the Philippians, chapter 4, verses 12, 14, and then they go to 19 and 20. And the gospel tradition according to Matthew, chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Well, as you remember, that Jesus has been issuing, as we kind of pointed out over the last 2 weeks, some parables against the leadership of the Jewish community in either or both Jesus' time or the time of Matthew. Now, once again, and I say this each time, the message is not against Judaism, but it's against certain Jewish leaders who are not fulfilling what their task should be. This week, the third parable is the parable of the banquet. Now, this is a particular parable that is used both by Matthew and is also found in Luke. And there are very important parallels here, but very distinctive ways in which these two writers chose to interpret this particular parable. Again, as we begin, a reminder that this parable is another example of how the writer uses allegory in telling his particular story. So it begins by the fact that there was, it begins by a reminder, listen up, you leaders. And always the idea, as Matthew tells these stories against the leaders, is that they would change their mind, that they would join with the community that Matthew represented, and that they would show good leadership to others. So it isn't that it's just being critical and then doing nothing about it, but there is a very strong wish that underpins what the writer is saying. King decides to have a banquet. Now, the banquet is being held for his son, and it is given the term of being a wedding banquet. So this is kind of a wonderful event, actually, and this is the king for his son. So you can see that there should be a lot of people who would be perhaps interested. And it begins by the fact that, so he's going to have this banquet, and he sends out his messengers to invite certain people to come. They decide not to. Now, at the first point, there is no reason given. And why would he do this? Well, you send out an invitation. I suppose those of you who have had children or yourself have gotten married, you send out invitations. And included in your little invitation for those whom you are going to invite to the banquet is a card saying, would you please mail this back by a certain date, and say whether you're coming or how many are coming. Well, why? So that you can prepare and have enough food and enough drink also for all of those who are invited to the banquet. So that would be one of the things that would be the expectation on the king, that he would send this invitation. They were invited to a very important banquet, and to indicate whether they were coming or not. Now, sometimes they didn't respond. The invitees, can use that word, did not respond. Well, why? Well, one of the reasons is they wanted to see who else was invited. So before they were decided to come, they might not choose to attend. Or perhaps they wanted to know what the menu was. What's the king going to be serving here? If they're on a diet or something, well, maybe that they would not come. So there are some very human reasons why they did not immediately respond. And that's why the king sends out the message a second time. See, so that there was a kind of naturalness that people knew how the system worked. And when the second invitation comes, well, they don't give reasons. They don't even give excuses. In Luke's account they do, but in this account, no. One goes off to his farm, another goes off to do another task, or has something else to do, and refuses to come, and by this action, to come. So there is a certain pattern here that is being observed, but remember, when the king invites you to something, it certainly seems to bring dishonor in a certain way to refuse this invitation from someone who is so important, and especially, as I mentioned, that it seems to be his son, and it's put in the context of a wedding. So banquets, and this is the general theme that works here in this particular story, banquets were, of course, very important, but banquets were not as regular as we might think. You know, when you invited someone to a banquet, you probably were going to have meat. Meat was not a regularity in the daily pattern of people's eating in those days. For example, you know, when you as a mother or even go out somewhere, what do you look at the menu? What's the centering thing? Well, what's the meat? Is it pork? Is it beef? What it is? And then you build your meal around that. So when you had a banquet, it was going to be pretty good, and that would be something you'd be careful perhaps to reject. So wonderful food would be found at a banquet. It is, I think, with that in mind, that, with that in mind, the first reading from Isaiah is a picture of and you might want to read this or look at it, again, we can't do all of that here, but of a wonderful time in which there would be food for everyone, in which there rich food, and those who are on diet would say, well, I want that, don't want that. Yeah, but you didn't get rich food very often. So to have a rich food and wonderful wine, and everybody, says the prophet Isaiah, would be drawn to the mountain upon which God had chosen to place his people. This is called Mount Zion, and of course on the top of this mountain would be the city of Jerusalem. This particular little section from Isaiah, by the way, is often used at the time of funeral masses because it pictures God lifting the veil that causes suffering and pain to everyone. Of course, the veil here, as Isaiah is interpreted, is the veil of death. And so there's a kind of interesting use of this particular passage for celebration of funerals. Well, now, the master has prepared this meal. Well, let's not kid ourselves. He didn't do it, but he set up the menu, and then he got the servants to do it. The trouble in the parable now is that when these messengers are sent, some just refuse, others beat up the messengers. Sound a little bit familiar to the one that we heard, the parable we heard last time? So there is a certain continuity here of treatment. So they brutally maltreat and even kill some of the servants. Now, This is followed by suddenly kind of a little episode in between here. The king is angry, so what does he do? He sends in his troops, he kills them, burns their cities, and does them great harm. So be a little careful here always to see the king as necessarily God, although that's one of the ways in which this particular passage will be interpreted. Also, this parable reflects an idea that's found in the book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs pictures Lady Wisdom, who, and these are the words that appear in chapter 9 of Proverbs, dresses her meat, mixes her wine, spreads her table, sends out her maidens to call everyone from the heights to the banquet. So you can see that Matthew here sees Jesus as kind of telling a story, he who is wisdom, that involves everything is ready for the grand occasion. Does it work? Well, as we know, unfortunately, it doesn't. He now sends out his servants to the highways and byways to invite everyone and anyone who wants to come. Now, the invitation to these folks is very different than it was to the other people. You can imagine when the original invitation was given to those specific people, that you kind of came up to them, the messenger came to their house, maybe gave them a written invitation or spoke to them that they were invited. Now the invitation is shouted out. Anyone and everyone can come. Wait a minute. There's something wrong with this, because the people who were invited most likely belonged to a particular social group. And in the first century world, societies did not mix. Your social status determined who you ate with and whom you didn't eat with. That's why often Jesus gets into trouble when he's pictured as eating with tax or toll collectors and sinners and prostitutes, because they all belong to a social class that you, if you were wise, did not associate with, and certainly that you didn't eat with. So where do they go? Well, they go to into the city to invite people to come to this banquet. Now, I point this out because there's a very different approach here. When we think of the city today, unfortunately, do we not think of the city as where many poor live, where it is not, the housing is not, although certainly in certain cities in our time it's improving, but the cities turned out to be the place of the poor. Where were those who were well-to-do? They lived in what today we would call the suburbs. They lived outside of the poor lived outside of the city. See, now what I'm wanting to say is, in Jesus' time it was the reverse. I can mix this up, but in Jesus' time the rich lived in the city and the poor lived outside or in the suburbs. And that's why, if you look at the very structure of cities, you will notice that in the cities, the four major concerns of humans took place. Those of you who are a little familiar with the sociology we call of a city, is that you could take the pattern of a city and divide it into four quadrants. In one quadrant would sit the political issue, those who dealt with government. On another quadrant would be the marketplace, where you went shopping, where your foods were exchanged. And the third quadrant would be the religious. There would be where worship would take place, where temples were given in honor of God, or in the case of Israel, to Yahweh, to God. And on the fourth quadrant would be the social, where people would meet, where entertainment would take place. Think of how cities still, even cities today, are divided. Where are the seats of government? In the city. Where were the markets? Well, now this has changed in our time, but even half a century ago, you went to market. Those of you who have heard of the Broadway market. Well, that's because that's where a lot of activity took place in the city. So times have changed, where the rich, the more well-to-do, now live in suburbia, and the poor live in the city. But in the parable, that's why they go to the highways and the byways, and there weren't a lot of roads. Most of the roads, you remember, were pretty muddy. There were certain seasons of the year when you could never even use a road. And the good thing that the Romans did, of course, was to build permanent roads, and those were rare, and those were built so that the army of Rome could travel quickly from place to place. Now, my point is that it's bringing the outskirts into the banquet hall. So, allegorically, what is happening here, of course, is the invitation to God's kingdom, to God's way, is extended and given to everyone. So that's a little bit of a background to this parable and how it would be working. Who have rejected the invitation? Well, now you can see it's the leadership. They have, and they've been invited. The prophets have come and invited them a couple of times, but they choose to reject the invitation to come to the banquet of the Lord. Now, banquet, of course, tends to be the theme here, certainly as we saw in Isaiah. It also will be the theme in the psalm, which is used for today, that we would like to get to. But there's one other aspect to this parable. Some have said it's even a second parable attached to the first. After the invitations to everyone coming to the banquet, the king is pictured as coming into the banquet hall and discovering there a person who is not wearing a wedding garment. And he is ticked off about that. Why is this man come not wearing a wedding garment? Well, now, you might say, wait a minute, the guy just got the invitation. How did he have time to get a wedding garment? And why is this included? Well, and it's interesting the language that the king gives to this man, friend. The word friend used like this is only going to appear one other time, when Judas in the garden says to Jesus, friend. So there's we might use the word friend quite regularly, but here it's used only infrequently. And when Judas uses it, of course, the term is one of betrayal. And so there's kind of a sense when he says, friend, why are you here without a wedding garment? That the invitee has in some way betrayed the invitation of the king. Now, just as to kind of defend everybody, somebody said, well, you know what the king should have done, and maybe he did, was have a little closet with clothes for appropriately being at a wedding guest, as a wedding guest, and the guy should have just done that. That may be the case, but we don't have much evidence of such a thing being true. But anyway, it kind of gets the guy off the hook a little bit. But he's thrown outside where there will be the grinding and wailing of teeth. It's an interesting image. Have you ever heard someone grind their teeth? It's like running your hand on the chalkboard. Those of you who remember chalkboards can't do it anymore. Kids miss out on that event. But running it down, and that kind of grinding goes right through you kind of thing. So that's an interesting, as I say, conclusion to the general parable, or as someone has said, maybe this is a second little parable that's added there. Who exactly are the invited guests? You got it, the chief priests and elders. And what have they done? They've not respected the hospitality and invitation of the king. Now, Psalm 23 is the psalm that is used today. Remember last time I pointed out we have 2 Old Testament readings, so the second Old Testament reading for this week. Certainly a psalm that almost everyone has heard of, very, very popular in most Christian churches, and many in those churches could almost recite this psalm by heart like we can recite the Lord's Prayer. And you probably can recite the 23rd Psalm. But in case you don't, and everyone who works with this psalm, because of its popularity, tends sometimes to translate certain things just a little differently. But I'd like to kind of spend a little bit of time now to examine the 23rd Psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Now, the idea of God as shepherd, we've mentioned this before, is a very popular one. And the psalm is pictured as one of the sheep kind of writing this hymn. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In verdant pastures he gives me repose. Or another translation, he makes me lie down in green pastures. Or as another interpreter has said, he makes me lie down in clumpy grass. So it's really, now you might say, well, big deal. Well, if you're a sheep, that is really a banquet to have all of this grass. See the connection between the banquet, so what a wonderful banquet, food-wise, is provided by the shepherd. Beside restful waters he leads me, refreshes my soul. Well now, food and water. How important was water and is water even in our own time? So you see, the good shepherd provides an adequate food and water for the sheep and causes them, as I say, to lie down in the grassy plains. He guides me in right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk in the dark valley, I fear no evil. Now, what is the dark valley? Well, the dark valley, and obviously, is a place where maybe, if you now think of sheep, where you don't want to be kind of wandering or walking because it could be kind of dangerous. Or your enemies could be there. So dark valleys were difficult places that could be threatening to the sheep. So for example, in dark valleys might be weeds, poisonous things that you might eat. See, so when the picture is the good shepherd knows just where to bring the sheep and where to keep them out of. So I fear no evil because you are at my side. Wonderful is the shepherd who is with the sheep, who guides them. With your rod and your staff you give me courage. Or, as one translation says, with your rod and your staff you comfort me. So the support that the shepherd gives to the sheep. See how this is a beautiful image of God, and why perhaps we find it so important a prayer to use in our tradition. That the shepherd is ever there, always aware of our needs and of the dangers that could threaten us. Now comes the part that probably fits a little bit to the theme of today. You spread a table before me in the sight of my foes, or you spread a table before me in the presence of my enemies. There's a little difference here between sight of foes and presence of enemies. And you can see where translations, that's why I take this opportunity a little bit to point this out, that translations of very familiar works can give a little different emphasis, deciding on how the translator has chosen to choose a meaning for the words. So, a table, well, he's already provided the necessary things, but now you get this grand table again. Wonderful menu that is provided by the shepherd. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Now, one translation here points out, you anoint my head with fat. Now, you probably wouldn't like that. You might find oil, but fat. But see, fat, richness. Those of you who buy steaks know you like a little fat on it, even though you don't like to pay for it, because it says that this is going to be a very good piece of meat. So you anoint my head with oil. I don't know how you think of anointing, but they thought of it as you pour it over their head and it drips down. I'm sure you'd like that as a kind of something. But richness. Can you imagine that? See, the good shepherd. My cup overflows. Well, now, overflows. Someone has said that the word here, overflows, should be saturated. All the good things I need, fullness of them, the Lord gives. The shepherd gives to the sheep. The Lord gives to us. Or a simpler translation would be, my cup is well filled. So everything in it. And remember that I mentioned before, the use of the cup often suggests some kind of suffering. Well, here, a cup that is well filled would not have room for suffering. Only goodness and kindness, the psalm continues, shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord for years to come. So the psalm ends by saying that this is where I shall dwell, this is where my whole life shall be, with the Lord. So you can see why this psalm, the 23rd psalm, is so well liked and is so powerful in what it tells us. That much like later on when we come to the Lord's Prayer, when we pray, give us this day our daily bread. Give us the food that we need. Make us strong in the necessary foods and drink that enable us not only to get by, but even to more fully appreciate and enjoy life. So the parable of that, and that would be my kind of quick reflections on the 23rd Psalm. It is perhaps like other pieces of Scripture, one of the most commentated on, and you will find a number of different translations of different words. And again, as I pointed out, words do create images in our mind and in our thinking. So the Good Shepherd cares for and in abundance supports. So as we come this week again, listening to the generosity of God, inviting us to the banquet of goodness, to the banquet of compassion, to the banquet of forgiveness, That is the Lord's abiding and great gift to each and every one of us. But as the gospel writer Mark was concerned with, those who should have didn't get it, didn't appreciate it, we hope that we do as we hear, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In green pastures will I graze." See you next week.